Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I am the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Karen Roth. She's a nationally recognized leader in defense, innovation, and technology strategy. With deep expertise in STEM, partnership building, and strategic planning, she brings us passion for accelerating innovation and empowering diverse talent in STEM. I'm really keen to learn more about how she ended up in her current field, how she came to advocating for innovation and talent in STEM, and how being an effective communicator has benefited her so far. Welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Karen.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
Wonderful. So, from the bit of research I did on you, I saw that you studied software engineering. So, what was the motivation to do that?
It's one of those things where the simplest things lead to a whole path and a whole career. Whenever I went to college, it was back in the early 2000s, and software engineering wasn't really a big topic of needing to understand engineering and building software together. And so I thought I was on a computer science route. I liked programming. We did basic in our days, basic programming language and all of that in high school. And that's what I learned. And I seemed to be good at it. So I was on that path. And, my mom's on a call with a Microsoft rep trying to solve a problem. And he casually mentions that software engineering is the next big thing. And when I researched it and looked into it, I really liked the idea of more so being able to design and architect and understanding requirements and working with people to generate the end game. And I understood more about engineering and decided to give it a try. At the time, there was only a couple of universities that were doing it. And so I ended up at Rochester Institute of Technology because they were one of the early ones that did it as a bachelor's degree. And then my life has gone on from there.
Wonderful. But you didn't stop there. I saw you also got a master's in systems engineering. So, what prompted you to do that?
I really like the engineering side of things more than anything else and piecing together systems and seeing how they go together. And so, as a software engineer, since it really wasn't that well known what I did, a lot of people just assumed that I did programming and that was it, or scripting, or things like that. So, whenever the opportunity presented itself to pursue a master's degree, I decided to do the systems engineering route to make sure that it was built up of like, no, I really am an engineer through and through, and the design part of that. And so the systems engineering piece of that has allowed me to reach outside of just software development as well.
Okay. But then you didn't stop there. I saw you also got an executive MBA. So, what motivated you to get that?
Really like learning, right? Um, I'm not very good at test taking and doing certificates and things like that. So you won't see any of those on my resume, but I keep going back and getting degrees because I love learning. My husband has politely requested maybe, I have enough degrees at this point in time, but I'm not sure yet. We'll just see if I'm done. But I mean, that was really motivated by, right, I had work for a company at the time that was willing to support the degree. And I really liked that is part of the path and learning how to communicate outside of engineering and really building a portfolio and designing systems that can actually be bought, paid for, and integrated with other non-engineering systems and building that up. So I really felt being able to understand accounting, finance, marketing, all of those things that are around it actually has made me a better engineer with being able to pitch those ideas and concepts to people that don't traditionally work with engineers so that way they understand it and can do their job too.
Okay. So, when are you going to get the PhD?
We'll decide what's next. I got to find the thing that I care about enough to study it for 6 years.
For sure. But yeah, you definitely like school. That's for sure. But
I
so
do.
so now you've done all these degrees. I'm kind of curious, what type of work did you do once you were finished studying?
I've been an engineer in the defense area for my whole career. I've done laboratory and research work. I worked for an OEM at one point in time. And so like that's a big part of my history too, is like I just love learning different things. If you look at the strength finder assessment, my number one is input because I love taking in data and input and understanding how things work. So I've bounced around a little bit all within the defense sector. So, whenever I got my MBA, there wasn't really a next step from there other than it was able to be building up to then I had good qualifications to be a chief engineer and then a director level from there on out. And so it was a slow pivot after I got those different degrees into then finding what the next right job really looked like.
Okay. So I'm curious, you worked in the defense or work in the defense industry. Why defense?
Whenever I graduated, everyone thinks that there's a grand plan, but really the number one priority is I wanted to get paid. But number two, it really was as a software engineer, in order to do a lot of software engineering work, I had to find someone that was building large scale software systems, and was looking at doing that and understood the power of software and systems engineering. And really, the defense industry was one of the big leading edges of that, and needing to look at integrating a lot of disparate suppliers together. Like a lot of, for instance, a Black Hawk helicopter has 3 different suppliers on that helicopter base in order to make one helicopter. And so, from me being a software and systems engineer, needing to understand how to integrate all of those disparate systems on different software platforms was a really interesting problem to me. So that's really why I headed that direction. And now, whenever I took my first job, I said, well, I'll give this a try. And, I'm still mobile, I'm still willing to move. And so I'll be here a couple of years. 20 years later, I'm married a nice local boy and I'm still in the defense industry and keep on trekking.
Nice. With the moves that you've made throughout your career, were they planned or did they kind of just happen that way?
Sometimes I was looking, sometimes I was in the right place at the right time. I think my first move is that I did want to consciously leave and try something different. And I had a lot of conversations, but I was open to whatever and moving because I didn't have a family at that point in time. And I didn't know what I wanted to do truly. And so I took that. But then my next job was because I consciously wanted to move back to New York. And I found, I started having conversations. And the first conversation I had was the wife of someone else that worked for a different consulting company in the area. And she gave him my resume and, that kind of snowballed. And then because I was back in the area, someone that I had previously worked for reached out to me and said, just so you know, this job is opening. You should apply for it, even though, I didn't think I was necessarily ready for that job. And then when I took this job that I currently have now, it was the same kind of situation of like, I had done the previous one for 5 years. I had taken in all the input that I thought I wanted to do. And I had started having conversations with people, not necessarily applying for things, but having conversations with people to try and figure out what their outside opinion was on what I should be doing next. Like they saw what I was good at doing that job, but like what from their perspective were the next right jobs. And I think that those were really powerful conversations, getting outside perspective on, where my skills and assets really shined and where I could be valuable. So a couple of months into casually having those conversations, all of a sudden someone went tappity tap, tap, tap. Hey, just so you know, this job is opening. And that was the right time at the right place too. And so I think that those conversations, especially in this day and age of so many job descriptions out there, some of them being ghosts and not real job descriptions, not being able to find a real recruiter to talk to a lot of time through jobs, and where to navigate through all of that. It's your network is even more and more critical, and being able to get feedback on where your skill sets are, how to highlight them for changing jobs, to make sure that comes through to kind of rise to that top of that pile is so critical.
Yeah, I think you're right about that for sure. I'm curious, when you first started working, or even up until this point, what's one thing about having a job that you didn't anticipate?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think one of the big things is that, because when you're in college, you're given bounded assignments. You're told you have to do this thing. Here's your time frame in order to do it. deliver something to me, and you deliver what you have and it's graded. Especially starting my career in a research laboratory, the unboundedness of it took a lot of adjustment. And I've heard that from other engineers too, right? Like all of a sudden, like engineers by nature tend to be very structured, want to have boundaries around things, understand what they want to do. But then, so my first job assignment was essentially like, go learn about this area and write some papers. And I was like, oh, interesting. And that was actually a hard adjustment because it was easy to get distracted by other things. Like, oh, I want to go learn about this thing. I'm going to have a chance. And he didn't give me a deadline for this. So I'm going to go learn about this thing. Or, hey, the opportunity to go off and learn more about this interesting, or take on this other duties as assigned type of assignment and bring that in. And so learning how to be laser focused on output it in goals in an environment that's just going to tell you to go do your job. And I mean, I had great mentors that helped me get up to speed in terms of integrating, and I learned a lot from them, but I was never given a lot of specific things that I had to go do. And I had to learn how to develop that for myself. Otherwise, I wasn't going to get promotions and new assignments and things like that if I didn't have any outcomes from my first assignment.
Wow. Yeah, that could be interesting. That could be a difficult transition to make. Yeah, I think you're right. When you're in school, it's more defined, and then when you get into a workplace, and perhaps it's not as defined. And if you're used to that, then that's a tough transition to make for sure. You know, when you were talking, it made me think about what I mentioned earlier in the intro with your advocacy work in innovation and diversity in tech. And so I'm kind of curious, what kind of work do you do in those two fields?
I mean, most of my work is through the Society of Women Engineers. I'm the current president of that organization. It's a international 501c3 with 50,000 members. I also support my local Girl Scout council. I've supported local tech councils in the area, but really shining a light on diversity in tech and how powerful and important that is. There's some engineering fields that are starting to pick up in terms of diversity and inclusion. Engineering and specifically software is still not one of them, even though interestingly enough, computer science was really started by women through the early programming languages that were developed and the early human computers, like we've heard about through Hidden Figures, things like that. Like the art of computer science and mathematics that drove that was really developed and honed by women in the early days of that. And so being able to shine a light on that history and bring women back into that field is critical. And we see a lot of times environments where, especially stories out of Silicon Valley, where women taking job assignments, increasing harassment, culture, inclusion types of issues. And so the work of the Society of Women Engineers focuses a lot on professional development, leadership training for women, and how that we can fit into those types of environments and not only fit in, but then influence them as well. That's really critically important to me as I see, especially other women like in civil engineering fields, things like that, all these women that I meet through SWE and struggling to find their place and what that means. And I've got two little kids. They're 3 and 5 right now. And so they've been along with me for that SWE journey. And one of the things that I've been told over and over and over again is like, I'm publicly being a mom and an engineer. And that's still something that isn't done today. Like it's starting to become more okay, but a lot of women are really nervous to show the side of them that's the mom because they're afraid that then it will take away from their technical acumen and being able to be technical, because people will start to make assumptions about, oh, they can't stay late, oh, they can't do this assignment, oh, they can't fly, oh, they're not going to want to take this promotion. The amount of women that I've heard from that are like assumptions were made on their behalf because they were a mom, especially in terms of promotions, is staggering. And so just being open and really honest about being a mom and bringing my girls to things and including them in things has been important from that perspective. And so that's why that DEI piece is still really critical to me as well, and being able to bring more women in and show them that they do belong here.
What do you think leadership training should entail?
A lot of our leadership training really is not shockingly different from other types of organizations. It's more making sure that women have access to it. And so that's one of the big feedbacks that I've heard is, if they're not included in leadership training at work, then they have access to it through SWE. But also one of the other things too is about being able to ask the hard questions about how do I navigate these types of scenarios. And so like if you start down a path about being and what does being a good leader look like and all that, it looks the same for men and women, but it's the hard questions that change. And so being in an environment that they feel comfortable asking those questions to other people that have gone through those same types of scenarios with them is the big difference in what it looks like in SWE versus anywhere else.
Interesting. Because when I think about leadership, it seems to be very specific in this kind of, depending on who you're leading, you have to do it a certain way, as opposed to there's just being the one way to be an effective leader. Because you could be in one place and do it one way and it's received well, and then you do it a different way somewhere else and it's received well, and you never really know until you're in those positions and what people want and what they respond to. So that's the main reason I was curious to see, with SWE or with leadership training that you've been involved with or had exposure to, what does it entail? But as you said, at least it sounds like it's the same no matter where you go.
Well, and I suppose I should qualify that, right? I mean, there's definitely an aspect about being a leader, about needing to adjust and change for the team that you have and being able to bring them up. But if I look at the training that I've been in for work or through my MBA versus SWE, like those different types of scenarios of like being an inclusive leader or being an authoritarian leader, and when you bring power to the table and when you let your team lead, and how do you lead without power if you don't have supervisory experience? Like broadly, those types of concepts, I see them on both sides. Like I did executive coaching for a year, and one of the things that we really focused on was bringing power to a role as like a chief engineer role that wasn't supervisory, but was a policy type of authority of like, all right, I'm going to set the policy for the organization and I expect you to follow it, type of thing. And how do you bring the rest of the team along with it? Now, in a defense type of environment, that's going to look different than in a SWE type of environment where it's very volunteer run. People are there willingly because they believe in the mission, those types of things. Now, I'm going to see that differently on both sides, but when it goes back to, all right, when I'm only with other women in a leadership training and development course, or at least predominantly women, because right, SWE is a 501c3, everyone's welcome to join, just the mission is promoting women. And so anyone can join any of our trainings. There is still going to be more focus on things like, all right, well, someone hasn't listened to me. Even though I've done everything that I'm supposed to do according to my leadership training, I'm still having trouble with this person listening to me, hearing my voice. How do I change how I'm doing that? And there will be a lot more conversation about that on the SWE side.
Interesting. Okay, so there does seem to be some differences than from something that is more women's focused as opposed to one that's not women focused, because there's certain, I guess, scenarios that perhaps women face that others, well, not others, but I guess men, who else is others, but others, but non-women face.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. All right.
Or at least in wider variety, right? Where we pride ourselves on being an engineering organization, so we actually do a ton of research. And so like if you look at, we did a culture study, it was probably a decade ago about this point in time, but just a culture study across all of engineering. And one of the big things that you see is like, all right, I feel heard, all right, I feel like I've ever encountered this scenario and those kinds of things. It's not that Men never encounter some of the same scenarios that women do. It's just women encounter them in much higher rates. And so usually when we ask, men versus women the same question, and they say, well, have you ever been asked to go get the coffee when you're supposed to be an engineer? For example, 10 or 15% of men will still say yes, but 50% of women will say yes. And so that's where the focus really changes to, all right, well, we need more support on this side. But where also men come in and look to join and take advantage of all the trainings and everything that we offer too, to also get that different perspective, which I always appreciate.
Wonderful. Karen, when I first started this podcast and YouTube channel, and even to this day, it's been about the struggles that people with technical backgrounds have with speaking in front of others. And it all started with me having difficulty giving presentations in front of management on a monthly basis, which was part of my job. I got a lot better at it over time, but those first few presentations were rough at best. But I'm kind of curious, when it comes to your speaking journey, is that something, speaking in front of others, is that something you've always been good at? And if not, what did you do to get better at it?
Oh no, absolutely not. And it's something that's taken a little practice for sure. And anytime I go back and talk to my alma mater with RIT, I'm still on one of their advisory councils and still go back to there pretty often. Like, one of the things when they say, what do we need? I'm like, more communication classes. Like, that was the thing that, there's a little bit required as part of it as ABAT, and RIT being like heavy teamwork based experiential learning to start with was really influential in like giving me a good platform to start with. But the reality is, right, you're taught how to be an engineer, but there's never a scenario in this day and age where you get to go in your garage, program things by yourself for years at a time, and then magically become a billionaire anymore. Right? You will always need to pitch your ideas to funders. You will always need to integrate in teams in a larger corporate environment. You will always have to have ways to communicate. Even engineering discipline to engineering discipline. Like, I'm primarily a cybersecurity engineer by training these days. And so like, I remember running down the hall because an avionics engineer had talked someone into taking a piece out of an aircraft that I was looking at, and I needed it because it was already security certified. And she's like, well, I can just replicate that software on my box. My box is certified. You cannot take my box. But that took like more conversation than it should have, in order to, because one engineer is like, I can solve that problem. And the other engineer is like, I've already solved that problem. You can't take my box. And so even discipline to discipline and being able to understand the priorities that each group has can be a big communication gap. And then when you go outside of then the discipline, then it jumps even higher from that. I still, get feedback that I talk too much and use too many words sometimes, even though I've gotten better at that over time. But if you go back to college, and I was asked to speak in front of a crowd, I would try my best to hide in the back and shift my way back to where maybe no one would find me or get a hold of me or things like that. And then when I shifted into work mode, it turned into the amount of anxiety that will bubble up every time I had to present or have an idea. And I think one of the big things was having a good mentors and the people to say, look, you are an expert in this. They do want to hear from you. And it is okay, we all started here, and continuously telling me that over and over again. But also SWE was a big part of that, right? I went from wanting to hide in the back of the room to walking out in front of 8,000 people at the most recent conference and on multiple occasions and being able to do that. But the big thing is practicing in front of a friendly audience, so that way when they can give you the feedback, they can tell you what you can stop doing and what you need to enhance doing and work on. But when I walked out in front of those 8,000 people, I realized, even though I was nervous about doing it, I realized that it was a friendly audience because this was my family. I'd been part of SWE for decades, and that there wasn't a single person out in that audience that was trying to challenge me on anything or rip apart my research or find what the problem area was. They were all genuinely a supporting community. And then it became easy from there. And so I think if you practice in those types of communities, things like Toastmasters, I know a ton of engineers use, and being able to build that up, that confidence in the way that you know how, like it's a critical skill and you have to have that to be a successful engineer. So whatever mechanism that you need to do, go for it. My mechanism was actually SWE, and being able to practice in front of those friendly audiences for so long at this point in time.
Nice. So for the people who are watching or listening to our conversation, Karen, and they see the benefit of getting better at speaking in front of others, what's the first thing that they should focus on to make that happen?
I think the number one thing to focus on is, um, being very conscious about what your audience wants to hear, right? A lot of times, and what I hear other engineers doing is they talk to the things that they want to hear, and therefore they think that's what the audience wants to hear. I once had to talk about when and go talk to a group of legislators locally, about, the future and what we were working on and things like that. And I talked to them in terms of profit and loss because I knew that's what they cared about. They cared about how the work that we were doing was going to impact the economy and what investments that they should be making. And at the end of that conversation, right, one of them comes up to me. He's like, "That's the first time that one of you people talked that I think I understood it." But it was you people, right? Just like this mysterious kind of entity that talked in language that other people that were smart and intelligent but just wasn't their field didn't understand. And so I think that that's the big thing about is making sure that you understand the value proposition of the person you're talking to, and what they need to take away is going to be the biggest thing and the biggest first step.
Yeah, I think a lot of engineers forget that they weren't always engineers. I mean, you went to school, you got that degree, got that education, and then you took on a technical role most likely. But that took time and a lot of effort to get to know what you know, and then you want to speak to people who didn't do all that and assume that they're going to know what you know. But what are the odds of that?
Right.
Yeah, you know what, Karen, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest. How can
Well,
people get
thank
in
you for
touch with
having me.
well, how can people get in touch with you?
President at SWE.org for the next couple weeks. And then after that via LinkedIn.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. I am Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.